Hello everyone, I want to do a comparison video today of white pigment ink pads. I have been on a mission to find the perfect white pigment ink pad ever since the bouquet video I shared a few weeks ago. I used the Stays On Opaque in Cotton White, which was the only one I had at the time, and I struggled with it. You have to keep re-inking the Stays On ink pad, otherwise it just doesn't work. It comes as a set with the stamp pad and the re-inker, and the re-inker is there for a reason. If you don't keep re-inking it, the stamp pad just doesn't work, and that's the biggest issue with me. You can't just, put your blending tool in and expect it to work like you can with other ink pads. And so at the end of the bouquet video, where I persevered with this one here, I asked for your thoughts on other alternative white pigment ink pads. Now, I should have listened to you guys, because the majority of you recommended the Hero Arts in Unicorn White, and at the time I couldn't get hold of it. It wasn't available in the UK on either Amazon or eBay. I could only get it from the US, and the shipping was just absolutely horrendous, so I opted for the Tim Holtz Distress Ink in Picket-Fence, expecting it to perform just as well as the other distress inks that I've got, which I absolutely love, and it just didn't. And I should have listened, because only one person recommended the Distress Ink. Several others of you recommended the archival Brilliance in Moonlight White. So after failing, not miserably, but not having the success that I was hoping for with the Distress Ink in Picket-Fence, I then decided to go on and purchase the archival Brilliance in Moonlight White, and that one, in my opinion, performs much better than the Distress Ink. Then a week ago, the Hero Arts suddenly appeared on Amazon in the UK for a very reasonable price, and I thought, oh, for goodness sakes, in for a penny, in for a pound, and I ended up purchasing this one as well. So now I have four, so I am going to share my thoughts and do a test for you, so that you can decide for yourselves which one out of these four you think is the best. I'm going to be testing it on 4 different substrates. First of all, I use this tag here, which is white cardstock that I have coloured with Distress Ink in Wilted Violet and Picked Raspberry. I've just applied this with a piece of cut and dry foam. I also test on black cardstock and craft cardstock. I initially use a homemade stencil. This is just a stencil that I've used my different size circle punches to create. And I also test with some stamps as well. I've got these 3 stamps here that are covered in white pigment ink. As you can see, I've got a script stamp, this Harlequin stamp, which is one of the Tim Holtz ones, and just a little foam leaf stamp. And I think this will give you a really good comparison, and hopefully you'll find this really helpful. So I'm going to put the video onto fast forward for you now and do a voiceover, and I will explain my thoughts as I go along, and then we'll have a look at the results at the end of the video. I'm testing these inks on a Distress Ink background. I've used white 300 GSM cardstock, and the colours I'm using are Picked Raspberry and Wilted Violet, which I've applied to the cardstock using a blending tool. Now, the first ink I'm testing is the Distress Ink in Picket-Fence, and you can see that it's going on nice and smoothly. I'm just using a circular motion to apply the ink through the stencil, but it's not very deep. It's not very bright white, and I get quite a lot of bleed through from the Distress Ink underneath. Now, it does get more pigmented the more applications I apply. You can see that that second layer of white is brighter than the first layer that I added, and later on I start doing a pouncing action, and again, sort of, that's much more vibrant than just using it in a circular motion. But this isn't as vibrant as any of the other inks that I use. The Distress Ink has contaminated my ink pad, so I'm just wiping it away with a baby wipe, and that does the trick. Second ink I want to test is the archival Brilliance Ink in Moonlight White. I'm using a fresh blending pad for this as well, so that it's not contaminated with any of the Distress Ink, and I'm just applying it in a circular motion in exactly the same way. Now, this is much more vibrant, as you can see, than the Distress Ink, and I'm just going to apply layers in exactly the same way so that I get a true comparison. So here I've got the two tags side by side, and although I've got more circles on the second tag, you can see that the Moonlight White, the Brilliance ink, is clearly more pigmented than the Distress ink. So now I want to test out the Hero Arts pigment ink in Unicorn. So again, I just apply the ink in exactly the same way. Now you can see that this is much brighter than the previous two inks, although once it dries it doesn't stay quite as vibrant as it looks now, but still definitely a contender in my eyes. And what I like about this ink is that you get this lovely halo around those circles, and I think that gives a really nice effect. So I just continue to build up the layers the same as I did with the previous two, so that we get a good comparison. So let's try the Stays On ink in Cotton White and see how that compares. I start to apply the ink in the same way as I've done with the previous inks, and you can see that it just isn't happening. And that's because I haven't added any re-inker to the pad since the last time I used it. And that is the big problem for me. You have to re-ink this stamp pad every time you use it. You'll also see that I'm trying to add the ink in a circular motion like I did with the previous inks, and that just doesn't work either. It's just too sticky and slippery for that. You have to apply the ink in a pouncing and twisting action, and you have to press really hard. So if you have problems with arthritis and pain in your hands, then I would say that this is definitely not the ink for you. It's much more difficult to use than any of the previous inks that I've tried. However, you'll see at the end that, you know, it's much more pigmented. So it does have, you know, some good points. It's really pigmented. I get really nice results, but it is just much more difficult to use. And as I say, you do have to re-ink the stamp pad after every use, otherwise it just isn't going to work. And you can see here now that I'm starting to run out of ink, and I'm having to work harder to get the pigment. It's getting paler and paler and paler, and that stamp pad now needs re-inking again. Let's see how these inks work on black cardstock with some stamps. I start off using the Distress ink in Picket-Fence, and you can see that it just isn't happening. I've tried 3 different stamps and I'm hardly getting any impression from any of them, not working at all. So let's have a go with the Brilliance. Now you can see that I'm wiping the stamps off in between as well, so that there's no contamination, using that Harlequin stamp by Tim Holtz and getting a much better, more pigmented impression straight away. Love that ink. This one really works for me. So let's try it with the Hero Arts, and again, nice and pigmented. In fact, the Hero Arts performs better on black cardstock than the Brilliance does. So it's amazing, you get different results when you're stamping than you do with stenciling, as you can see, and I'll show you the results all together right at the end. Now I want to try the Stays On, and you can see that I started to stamp before I had re-inked the stamp pad, and not really very vibrant at all. Much more vibrant now that it's been re-inked. And again, I'm testing all 3 of these stamps just to see how they stand up. Now that the ink's had a chance to dry, let's have a look at the results. In my opinion, I think Brilliance comes first place. I think it's really nice and white and vibrant on black cardstock. Hero Arts comes second, Stays On third, and Distress Oxide definitely last. You can barely even see the Distress ink on black cardstock. And I think Distress ink is one of those types of inks you could see when I built it up on the tags, that you've just got to build up layers of ink, and it can work really nicely and give you subtle effects, but stamping, I don't think it really works very well at all. So Brilliance for me, out of the 4 inks I've tried, definitely gets first place. I've also done the same thing on craft paper, and again Brilliance for me gets first place, followed by Hero Arts coming a very close second. I think these 2 on craft paper are definitely comparable. Stays On, surprisingly, didn't hold up too well on craft craft paper, and distress ink you can hardly see at all. I also decided to try it on a distress ink background again. Distress ink here you can hardly see at all, so that's the distress ink in the Picket-Fence. You can barely see it on here. The Brilliance again definitely gets first place in my opinion as far as stamping goes. Hero Arts very similar, but not quite as white as the Brilliance ink, and StazOn again not faring too well as far as the stamping tests are concerned. And I think the reason for that is when I was using this StazOn through a stencil, it's very opaque, and I was able to build up the layers, so it works much better when you're stenciling with it than it does when you're stamping. So let's see how the inks performed now that they've dried on the distress ink background. This first one here is the distress ink in Picket-Fence, and actually I really do like this as a bouquet ink. It's nice and subtle. It does pick up some of the colour from the distress ink I've used in the background, but it's sort of like a ghostly effect, and it's actually very pretty. And this is where I can see me using this ink, so it's definitely not going to go to waste. I will use it for bouquet technique. So that's the distress ink. This one here is the Brilliance ink in Moonlight White. Let me just check. Yeah, Brilliance. And I just love the effect of this. I love the fact that, you know, I've been able to get more depth the more layers that I've added, and I just absolutely love the halo effect that you get with this ink too. Just really pretty. So that's that one there. This one is the Hero Arts ink. That one's actually quite similar to the Distress Oxide. Once it's dried, it's faded considerably. Still really pretty, but very similar to the Distress Oxide. So, you know, so far the Brilliance still coming out best. And this one here is the StazOn. Now, whilst I was testing, the StazOn looked much more vibrant than any of these, but as it's dried, the colours have really toned down. And I just think that in order, Brilliance is definitely my favourite, followed by StazOn, followed by the Tim Holtz Distress ink. There we go, that one there, Tim Holtz Distress ink, and then the Hero Art. So, you know, you can see that you get very different results when you're stenciling compared to stamping. So that's those. Let's have a look how they performed on black cardstock. So this one here is Distress ink. So that one's Distress ink in Picket-Fence, and that's more grey than it is white. So that's how that one performed. You know, nice and neat and tidy. I've got no contamination over the rest of the tag, so you know it's stamped nicely and very well. This one here is the Brilliance. Quite like this as well, you know, that's worked nicely. This one here is quite grey, not as grey as the Distress ink, but you know, I don't know, this it's sort of like a fuzzy white effect. And this one here is the Hero Arts. But the best one on black cardstock is definitely the StazOn. So for all of the, you know, negative points about the StazOn, the stickiness and the fact that you've got to keep re-inking with it, as far as stenciling with it and building up your layers, there really isn't any comparison, in my opinion, between the StazOn and the other three. So StazOn is number 1. Followed by the Brilliance, number 2, Hero Arts, number 3, and Distress coming in number 4. Let's have a look how it performed on craft cardstock. In a similar way to the results that I got with the Distress ink stamping with it on craft cardstock, it didn't perform very well with the bouquet technique stenciling with it either. Very pale. Not worked great at all. So that is the Distress ink in Picket-Fence. This one here is the, oh hang on, let me show you the Brilliance next so that I'm doing them in the same order. Hang on, let me just show you. So this one here is the Brilliance ink. So there we go, the Brilliance in Moonlight White. Quite pretty, and you could see that I was able to build up the layers. I should have kept going because, you know, it's faded considerably as it's dried. So that one is the Moonlight. This one here is the Hero Arts in Unicorn. I actually prefer the Brilliance, even though this is whiter. This one is just, I don't know, I just don't like the effect as much. Even though it's a brighter white, I actually prefer the Brilliance. But again, the one that's performed the best is the Stays On Opaque. And again, it's because I was able to build up those layers. It's very pigmented and very, very opaque. So in first place, it's got to be Stays On Opaque in Cotton White. Second is the Brilliance Ink in Moonlight White. In third place, then it's Hero Arts, and a non-contender really as far as I'm concerned is the Distress Ink in Picket-Fence. So those are my results that I hope were of some value to you. I hope you found them useful. So would I buy the Stays On Opaque again? I think it's absolutely brilliant. I changed my opinion. I said when I was doing the bouquet that I would never invest in Stays On Opaque in Cotton White ever again. But, you know, I think if you look at the results on Craft Cardstock and Black Cardstock, it's got to be a contender, hasn't it? I just think if you can put up with the fact that you have got to keep re-inking that ink pad, it is very, very opaque and very, very white, but only if you are stenciling with it and you can build up those layers, because as far as stamping with it is concerned, it just doesn't perform very well. So it really does depend on the application. So there you go. That concludes my test with the white pigment ink pads, and I hope that was helpful to you. If you did find it helpful, as always, I would really appreciate a thumbs up, and, you know, please share this. I think lots of people would be interested in the results that I've achieved today. So as I say, you know, please share this on other social media and let me know what you think in the comments below, and let me know if you've tried any other types of white pigment ink and have achieved great results. Anyway, take care everyone, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye for now.